And before we get started, today is a solemn day, as you all know. And so we would like to take just a moment to have just a moment of silence. And I'm going to put something up on my screen so that people who join us late will know that that it's not that something's wrong, but that we're having a moment of silence. So let me get that going. And then we'll take just a moment. If I can get to it. Go.
There's like I'm missing something.
We're going to do a 9/11 thing this morning.
I can't get any voice.
Dumbass. It's a man not to know what we're doing.
Okay, thank you for that. We were having a moment of silence if you came in late in honor of the, sorry, there's my, in honor of the 9/11 victims. So thank you for that. And now on with our program.
Okay.
So I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Smith. Dr. Michael Smith is a professor of political science and chair of social sciences at Emporia State University. He has authored or co-authored 3 books, the most recent of which is co-authored with 2 Emporia State colleagues, Drs. Bob Grover and Rob Catlett. It is entitled Low Taxes and Small Government, the Brownback Experiment in Kansas, and was released by Lexington in 2019. I happen to have a copy right here, which I can't get to show. He has other academic publications as well, and also writes newspaper columns carried throughout Kansas as part of the Insight Kansas group and blogs for the MPSA. Michael appears occasionally on television and radio in Kansas and Western Missouri to discuss state and national politics. He was an expert witness for the plaintiff in the Bedasnik, I totally mangled that. You'll have to correct me later. Versus Kobach case decided together with Fish versus Kobach by the Federal District Court for Kansas in 2018. Michael teaches courses in American politics, state and local government, and political philosophy. He received his PhD from the University of Missouri in 2000. And please add if there's something more recent, because I pulled your biography off of a blog. So please add if you would like to. So let's welcome Dr. Michael Smith. Thank you. All right, you're muted. You're muted, Dr. Smith.
So I am. Did we ever think that "you're muted" would become part of our everyday lexicon before 2019? All right. Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. One thing you didn't mention, Anne, is, if I remember correctly, was the older Jim Calvert your father? Yes, he collaborated on that book. He isn't listed as a co-author by his own request, but he is acknowledged in there. And so, small world, huh? And the only other thing I'd throw in there is, just because it's relevant to what we're going to talk about today, is I do have another book coming out. It's edited. I'm a contributor and editor with several colleagues at ESU and other schools, and it's about voting laws. So hopefully I have some reasonable qualifications to talk about our topic today. So I thought what we would do to get started, I'm not a big PowerPoint person. I occasionally use PowerPoint, particularly to make posters. It's kind of a handy way to do that, but I'm not one that just, when I teach, I'm in there showing PowerPoint the whole time. That's just kind of not how I roll. So my poor students have to just listen to me standing there talking, unless I have a specific graphic that I want to show. But I thought I'd spice it up with a little bit of a screen share at the beginning, and I'm going to do that right now. What I'm going to show you is what's called the Voting Laws Roundup from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. And I think that that's a really good summary of things. They do a great job of staying on top of all the states and what they're doing on voting laws. And we used it quite a bit in writing that book that's coming out next year. And it will give us even a few maps and so forth that we can talk about. So before I do that, just the big picture. And the thing with the League of Women Voters is you all are already so plugged in, you're already so involved. There are a lot of things you don't need me to tell you. For example, you don't need me to tell you that there are widespread conspiracy theories falsely alleging that there was voter fraud in the 2020 election. You don't need me to tell you that Chris Krebs, who was a Trump appointee, headed the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the federal government, stated that the 2020 election was actually the most secure election in all of US history. You don't need me to tell you that in 2016 and again in 2020, there was widespread attempts by Russia and other foreign governments to interfere in US elections. In 2016, in a few cases, they were actually to hack into some voting equipment in Illinois and Florida. Didn't change the results of any election, but it's still disturbing. A lot of safeguarding took place between 2016 and 2020 to make that far more difficult. And just as a rule, and I think Mr. Krebs agrees with this, voting equipment simply should not be connected to the internet, period. Using optical scanners to read paper ballots and things like that is fine, but voting equipment connected to the internet is probably asking for trouble. Well, there's no problem. It is. And when people say, well, if that's true, then why isn't there bank fraud with online banking? The answer, of course, is that there is. There's plenty that we hear about and far more that we don't. We don't want that happening with our elections. So that's kind of the state of where we are. Finally, you don't need me to tell you that many states, especially those where the Republican Party is a majority in the legislature, have moved pretty aggressively to restrict voting laws anyway, even though the 2020 elections were the most secure in US history as certified by an expert. By doing things like restricting early voting, restricting mail-in voting, which is where a lot of the controversy, unnecessary controversy, fell in 2020. Also, though, a little bit disturbing, some of these laws appear to be targeting the League of Women Voters. You know this because this is what you do, right? You're the premier voter registration organization in America in many ways. And laws such as the one in Kansas, which makes it a felony to impersonate an election officer, which could be misinterpreted and misapplied very easily. Laws generally restricting third-party voter registration drives appear in some ways to be targeted at the League of Women Voters. I don't know if you remember when Chris Kobach was Secretary of State of Kansas, he called the League of Women Voters a communist organization. And he did not mean that as a joke. So some of these things are kind of disturbing. We do need to secure our elections, by the way. That's absolutely true. And a lot of things were done in 2020 to do just that. So the premise that we should secure our elections is correct. But as the internet meme would have it, you're doing it wrong. Many of the state legislatures appear to be doing it wrong. Let me take my camera off here so that you don't see it jump around and accidentally give you vertigo, and do a little screen sharing, if I may. Let's look at that Brennan Center Voting Laws Roundup. Let's see if I can do this. I'm about to try. All right. Can you all see the map?
No.
Yeah,
map.
no, we cannot. Let me make sure. Yeah, I've got you. You should be able to share.
Okay, I have an idea. Do not despair. Give me just a second. And I won't, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I won't make you spend hours watching me fumble with technology. But if we can do this, let me try something very, very quickly. All right, one moment. There always has to be a technology glitch, doesn't there?
Yep.
Okay. And again, if this doesn't work, we'll just live with it. But give me one more minute, literally one more
Okay.
minute.
I'll vamp a little while you're doing that.
Oh, I think that would be great. I like that idea.
Pat Bartholomew asked if the league is taking a stand against the death penalty. I don't know. I'm gonna throw that out there to some longer serving league members. Does anyone know?
Yes. We
I-
have a stand. You can look. Our St. Louis lady is very key on that, and I believe it should be in our state action.
Right. Kind of assumed we were against the death penalty.
Yes.
Okay, well, you are successfully sharing now, Dr.
Yay! Thank you,
All right.
everybody, for your patience. Well, I just thought we might take a quick look at some of these new restrictive laws that are passing, but also the glass is also half full. There are a number of expansive new voting laws passing as well, but it just sort of like the Brennan Center calls it, a roundup. There's a big move to shorten the window to apply for a mail-in ballot. And also, and I'm sure it's on this list too, yes, if you look a few items down there, eliminate or limit sending mail ballots to voters who do not specifically request them. That and related, eliminate or sending mail ballot applications also. That's a big push. And if you'll notice on there, Kansas is on there. Missouri, by the way, tried to pass some restrictive voting laws. Missouri Republicans really want photo ID, but they didn't get that passed, partly because it got hung up in other legislation. And of course, the Democrats oppose it. They're outnumbered, but the Republicans didn't prioritize it either. And there's a court ruling on that too. But anyway, you'll notice in this first list I'm showing you, there's a lot of push to make it much more difficult to cast a mail-in or an absentee ballot. Now, keep in mind that we have several states that now conduct their elections entirely by mail. Washington State was one of the first. Colorado followed shortly after. Oregon followed. And one of my favorite examples, in a state that does a good job, a very good job, is one of the most Republican voting states in America. It's Utah, which has followed Colorado's example. Of course, they border Colorado. And they've been very successful. Utah used to have one of the worst voter turnout rates in America. And it's gotten quite a bit better. And they have had very few administrative problems in Utah and in many of these other states. California is moving to this system, but administered by the counties and more of a hybrid system. And California, too, used to have one of the worst voter turnout rates in America, but now it's coming up. But clearly, the conspiracy theories after the 2020 election really focus on those mail-in ballots, and there's a real attempt to limit those. Now, hang on just a second. I'm going to unshare. I'm going to reshare, and I'm going to go on to the next picture. Okay. Does it now say something about signature requirements for mail ballots at the top of your screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Again, look at all the different ways in which the current restrictions focus on voting by mail, whether it be absentee or just straight up voting by mail. And again, that's the focus. But if you come down to about the middle of that list, voting purges is another issue, so-called voter caging. Typically, voter caging involves sending a postcard to a registered voter who hasn't voted in the last few election cycles. And if they don't return it, they're removed from the voting rolls. Well, you know as well as I do how much junk mail we get and how easy it is to toss something that looks like junk mail into the recycling bin before really looking at it. Plus, the thing about voter purges is they're frequently not conducted statewide or countywide. They're allowed to do these targeting certain precincts, and they're often urban precincts with a lot of people of color, which is a concern. The motor voter law back in 1996 was supposed to ban those, but it obviously contains loopholes. And then you just ban snacks and water to voters waiting in line. That got a lot of publicity in Georgia's voting laws. Election day registration, Montana's moving away from that. That was considered a positive reform in the 70s to eliminate closing dates and allow you to register to vote on election day. But we've got one state moving away from that. More voters per precinct. You can kind of see where this is going. And then finally, we've got limit early voting days or hours. There's a big push to eliminate early voting drop boxes after hours when there's no one in the precinct to monitor the traffic, and also limit them being placed outdoors, which can be really problematic for people that do shift work and often drop off their ballots at night. So look, here's the bottom line. There's this big push to move back to in-person voting at the polls on election day. And perhaps in and of itself, that's not a bad thing. But the problem is, are there going to be long lines, and will there be longer lines in some areas than others? Because we know from research that long lines are most often found in urban precincts and precincts that have a lot of people of color. This isn't just speculation or anecdotes. This has actually been studied. And the typical African-American voter in this country waits in line much longer than the typical white voter. The average time to vote, if you vote in person in America, is about 25 minutes total. That's arriving, standing in line, photo ID if you have to do that, voting, and getting out of there. That's your total. But there are a number of jurisdictions in this country. Georgia has the longest voting lines, whereas some people wait well over an hour. And Georgia's new voting laws calls for more polling places if voters have had to wait an hour or longer. But the problem with that law is it doesn't take effect till the next election. So it doesn't provide immediate relief to the people that are waiting in line right at the time. Now, before I get you all depressed, I'm going to screen share a little bit more, because I want you to know that the glass is actually half full. Can you see the new expansive laws on your screen?
No.
No. Okay. I did something wrong. 1 second. 1 second. That's weird, because mine says it is.
You just did for a moment.
Okay. I probably forgot to hit something that confirmed what I wanted to do. How's that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your help. Okay, so here's things that those of us that think it should be easier to vote, these are positive developments. Look at all the states expanding early voting. So you've got Kentucky, Louisiana, a host of different states, Oklahoma's on there, that actually are expanding early voting. Some states are kind of going both ways on this, like the new Texas law that passed just recently. It restricts early voting in some ways and expands it in other ways. So it's really complicated. But we're kind of going both ways on the expanding early voting. Same thing with mail voting. If you look at E's mail voting miscellaneous there, the very first state listed is California, two different bills in California. And by the way, these laws are laws that have passed. They're not bills, they're laws. They actually passed. That what you're looking at there. And so there's also a real focus on expanding early voting. In fact, it's getting to the point where we're going to vote two different ways. If you're in a red state, you're going to vote in person at the polls with ID. And if you live in a blue state, it's more likely, or in Utah, more likely that you may be voting by mail. So we're kind of going in both directions. Another thing that you all should know is that there's a big push now in many states to move away from signature verification. And that's an interesting side story. Signature verification has gotten very difficult because of people signing electronic pads instead of paper. If you've ever signed one of those electronic pads, and I think most of us have, you probably don't sign that the same way you sign a piece of paper. And many people just kind of make a squiggle or what have you. And they're having a terrible time now in Colorado and other states with signature verification because the signatures they have on file were signed on those electronic pads, and they're not matching the paper signatures. So the new thing is to have you write down an ID number from a state ID like your driver's license and just forget the signature verification because it's not working. So there's that. If you look at the bottom of that list, also some states are moving toward expanding the opportunities for drop boxes. All right, I apologize, by the way, for the stray marks. Whoop, forgot to hit a button. There, apologize for the stray marks on this one. Those are just my mistake. They don't mean anything. But anyway, ease voter registration. This was huge in the 70s, the 1970s. All the way back then, there was some thinking, why exactly do you have to register to vote 25 days before the election, like is the case in Missouri and Kansas? There's no reason, even using 1970s technology, why people couldn't register to vote in the same day. Election day registration or same day registration. Election day registration is same day registration, but only on election day. A number of states adopted this. Wisconsin did, Minnesota, North Dakota did away with voter registration altogether. Maine adopted it, New Hampshire. And now you can see that easing voter registration by easing the documents required or by getting rid of or shortening that what's called the closing date, the deadline you have to register before the election, is also happening in a number of states. Greater access to voters with disabilities, language accessibilities, polling place access. There's some controversy about so-called poll watchers, people that allege voter fraud and watch people vote, although they can't watch them mark their ballots. That can be intimidating. Prohibit discrimination. So there are just a number of other things. I think you've got the idea now. So I'm going to go ahead and move on from the screen share, but I hope that's been useful. Now let me tell you a little bit about our book, because that's what professors do, right? We have to promote our books. So this new book is called Much Sound and Fury, or the New Jim Crow, the 21st Century's Restrictive New Voting Laws. And what my colleagues and I did is we broke down these voting laws. Now, we didn't do a lot with mail-in voting because mail-in voting was pretty new when we started the project a few years ago. We do have an appendix on the 2020 election and aftermath, but that's not our focus. Instead, what we really focused in on were certain categories: photo ID, proof of citizenship, gerrymander, pardon me, I just learned recently it's pronounced gerrymandering, and I learned that from a League of Women Voters volunteer, gerrymandering. And then we also looked at one of the kind of stealth issues that's maybe not so stealth anymore, felony disenfranchisement. So if I could, I'll just go over those briefly and tell you about some of our findings, and then it's Q&A from then on. So first of all, photo ID laws, that's a big issue in Missouri. Kansas already has it. And there's a real push. It actually did pass a while back. Pardon me while I have a sip of coffee here. That actually did pass a while back, the photo ID in Missouri, but the Missouri courts struck it down. The Republicans in the General Assembly would like to reinstate it. And a number of other states do already have photo ID requirements, like Texas and so forth. This is an example of where there are exaggerations on both sides. since I say both sides, because so often voting laws break down into red and blue. Not that they should. By the way, the voting reforms back in the 1970s I was telling you about, that was not partisan. That was not Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. So it's interesting that it's become that, because back in an earlier day of voting laws reforms, it was regional. The South tended to resist, but it wasn't particularly partisan. And there were plenty of progressive Republicans, certainly, that were aggressive advocates of expanding voting rights in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and other states back then. So how things have changed. But let's just break this down, starting with the photo ID. So first of all, the claims that photo ID are needed are not so much exaggerated as false. That there's simply, even before 2020, wasn't any evidence at all of widespread voter fraud or anything but the most tiny scattered numbers of cases of voter fraud that would make it necessary to have photo ID requirements. They're just, the evidence just doesn't back it up. That in states that have voter ID requirements versus those that don't, it doesn't change the voting patterns. There's nothing in the states that don't have photo ID requirements that have strangely high patterns of turnout in certain precincts. That this has been studied half to death, including by the Brennan Center, and there is just nothing. So the case for photo ID is absolutely baseless. There are a couple of very scattered anecdotal examples, but probably the most telling ones come from Kansas when Chris Kobach was Secretary of State, and he got the state legislature to make him the only Secretary of State in America that had prosecutorial powers. And he went after alleged case of voting fraud. He only found about a dozen or so. Some of those didn't hold up. One was a citizen who was not fully naturalized before he voted. And he was prosecuted. He was a Peruvian national that became a US citizen, but he didn't complete his naturalization before he registered before he completed. I'm not sure he ever voted. The others were people that owned property in 2 states, and they thought they could vote in local elections in the other state, not presidential elections or Congress, but local elections. And the reason they thought that is because they paid property taxes in that other state. They also happened to be Republicans, which is interesting. And he prosecuted them as well, but there were very few cases. So the case for voter ID is baseless, but some of the rhetoric against it is also overblown. There's very little evidence of widespread voter suppression from voter ID laws. In fact, voter turnout only drops a little when voter ID laws are imposed. And different studies reach different conclusions, but it's about 2%. But some studies even go further, including a couple of the studies published in our book. They indicate that sometimes restrictive voter laws cause voter turnout to go up. And the thinking, and this is for further research, but we did do some in our book and it's ongoing. The thinking is that there's a backlash. Democrats and African-American Democrats, or Democrats of any race trying to mobilize African-American voters, have very aggressively used these laws passed by Republicans to stimulate their base, to say, they're trying to take your vote away, don't let them get away with it. And that appears to be working. In Pennsylvania in 2012, for example, we found some evidence that these restrictive voter laws combined with voter contact result in more people voting. And it may be evidence of a backlash. People, if you'll forgive the language, people are pissed off and they're actually more likely to vote. Now, I'm sure you know this, you all are so politically sophisticated that Georgia passed some very restrictive voting laws after the 2020 elections. And Senator Warnock is on the ballot in 2022 because he was elected to fill a partial term. If those voters mobilize angry African Americans, they could actually help Senator Warnock get reelected into a full term this time. Wouldn't that be interesting? Interestingly, though, overall, restrictive voting laws in the form of photo ID don't help either party. Now, in some pockets like Pennsylvania and possibly Georgia, they may actually be helping the Democrats, not the Republicans, the Democrats. But overall, it doesn't shift the partisan composition of the electorate to have photo ID laws. It does cause voter turnout to drop a little, but we forget sometimes when we make it partisan that they may be suppressing Republican voters too. Trump, after all, brought out voters that didn't vote in 2012. They didn't vote for Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. And some of those voters, for example, that were mobilized by Trump may be suppressed by photo ID laws. It's not just Democrats. So we have laws passed on a baseless premises that don't do as much damage as their opponents say, but may also benefit their opponents by fomenting a backlash with photo ID, at least in certain local rare areas. That's photo ID. Now let's move on to proof of citizenship. And this is another Chris Kobach issue. Kobach was a champion of these. He got them passed in Kansas and enforced them. He also championed them in other states. He was a consultant for voting laws in Arizona as well, and some other states. And the idea here is that to register to vote, you have to prove that you're an American citizen. This typically meant producing a birth certificate, but it could also mean a passport, Native American tribal papers, or naturalization papers if you're a naturalized American citizen. There were some major implementation problems with this law in Kansas. Over 30,000 voters registered to vote but did not complete it by providing the proof of citizenship and were removed from the voting rolls. But also there were anecdotal stories, particularly of Native Americans who were working with inexperienced poll workers who mistakenly believed that the law only allowed a birth certificate and rejected these Native Americans' voter applications in which they produced their tribal documentation, even though the law clearly states that that was acceptable as proof of citizenship. And that's another issue, and that's a great issue for the League of Women Voters, is poll worker training. Frequently, these laws are misinterpreted and misapplied by poorly trained poll workers. In fact, I even had a friend who, just to make a point, he went to vote in Lawrence and he brought his passport. And when they said, "I need to see your driver's license," he said, "I'm going to show you my passport instead." The law clearly states that a passport is photo ID, but so many counties have set up their system based on driver's licenses that he ended up waiting about 2 hours while they called election headquarters in order to implement a law that already clearly states that what he was doing was legal. So poll worker training is a huge issue here. But anyway, what about these laws? Prove you're an American citizen in order to vote. Well, first of all, the court case in which I participated was one that, and there was one in Arizona too, that stayed these laws. States cannot currently enforce proof of citizenship laws, so they are not in effect. And second of all, there is really kind of mixed evidence on these. We know that some voters were disenfranchised in Kansas, about 30,000. These voters were mostly unaffiliated. They did not register as Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians, which is the other party that's recognized in Kansas. In Missouri, of course, it's an open primary state. You don't register as a member of a political party. You declare that at the polls in the primaries. But in Kansas, most of the voters on what we call the suspense voter list, they were registered unaffiliated. Many probably would not have been frequent voters, but some would have. An interesting thing about Kansas is suspense voters that returned later with proof of citizenship and completed their registration are most likely to be found in college towns like Lawrence and Emporia. Voters that never returned with proof of citizenship and were removed from the voting rolls were most likely to be found in certain inner city areas, particularly in Wichita, but a little bit in Topeka as well, although interestingly, not in Wyandotte County. We did not see that there, but we saw it in Wichita, in particular, certain areas in North Wichita, which is known for its high African-American population. So the proof of citizenship laws didn't have a massive voter suppression effect, but they had a significant one. There's no evidence they changed the result of any elections, and they've been struck down by the courts, including in one case in which I participated. By the way, I've joined as an expert witness in another case now, and the plaintiffs are the League of Women Voters. They are suing over that law, making it a felony to impersonate an election official in Kansas. And I'm going to be helping them with that. So that's kind of exciting. So let's move on. let's move on to felony disenfranchisement. This does have a significant effect. Here's the thing about felony disenfranchisement. In certain states, many of which are in the South, but are now joined by Iowa, if you are convicted of a felony, theoretically, you can restore your voting rights by petitioning the governor or the courts. But in practice, you will probably never vote again in that state. Florida is an interesting one because in 2018, the voters passed an initiative to overturn that law and to restore the right to vote to people who had completed their sentencing, including all parole and probation. At the other end of the extreme, in Vermont and Maine, they not only don't have felony disenfranchisement, they set up absentee polling stations inside prisons. So they facilitate voting by people who are incarcerated in those two states. Now they're outliers. In Georgia, about 3% of the voting age population is disenfranchised because of felony disenfranchised, because it's a lifetime or very close to it. There's a small loophole, but most people don't get it. And 3% of people that would otherwise be eligible to vote. And a disproportionate share of that population in Georgia and other states is African American. Now, the other problem, though, with felony disenfranchisement is misunderstanding of the law. So in Texas, for example, there have been a very few high-profile cases where people were prosecuted, even sent back to jail for registering and voting while on probation. And it appears that these people did that in good faith. They didn't realize that they had to wait until the completion of their probation, but they were still prosecuted and sent to jail, which has a chilling effect. And just in doing voter registration work in Missouri and Kansas, I've encountered numerous individuals who mistakenly believe that they've lost their right to vote for the rest of their life because of being convicted of a felony, but they haven't been. Missouri and Kansas don't have those laws. You can vote again. In fact, the League of Women Voters of Kansas in Topeka, they send voter registration applications to people who have completed their sentences intentionally. But so I think the misunderstanding of these laws, the false belief that you've lost your right to vote for life when you haven't, is also a major factor suppressing votes. But at any rate, these laws, unlike the other ones, do have a distinct partisan cast. Felony disenfranchisement does disproportionately lower voter turnout in favor of Democrats. In other words, it lowers voter turnout that would have favored Democrats. So the laws favor Republicans. They're not as neutral as the other ones. They do have a measurable effect. They do lower voter turnout, and they do disproportionately fall on Democrats. So those are kind of the most serious laws in some ways of the first three I've discussed, is the felony disenfranchisement. And Iowa dramatically tightened its laws recently, whereas Florida has this ballot initiative. However, the state legislature doesn't want to implement it. So that is ongoing. But I really think another cause for the League of Women Voters is just the misunderstandings, the false belief in states where you can vote if you've been convicted of a felony, the false belief that you can't, egged on by these prosecutions of people that made good faith mistakes in states like Texas. But that's my opinion, although one that comes from my research. Okay, one more, and then I know you all want to do Q&A, and I love Q&A, so we'll do that. Just one more. Let's talk about gerrymandering. I just recently learned that that's how it's pronounced. Even Chief Justice Roberts, in some personal correspondence, has validated that it appears to be that former Vice President Elbridge Gerry did pronounce his name that way, and he drew the first known gerrymander made famous by a cartoonist. Couple of fun anecdotes about gerrymandering, besides the way it's pronounced, is that the original gerrymander, if you've ever seen that graphic, it looks more like a dragon than a salamander. And I learned from a student of mine recently who loves science fiction and fantasy that dragon is an archaic, salamander is an archaic term for dragon. So it doesn't mean salamanders like we would use that term today. So the word gerrymandering actually means Gary's dragon, which I think is super cool. But anyway, what about it? Well, it's extremely complicated. In the Rucho v. Common Cause case of 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that there is no objective definition of gerrymandering, and they upheld a 1976 ruling declining to get the courts involved in cases of gerrymandering if it's political. They ruled it was a political question, and that was upholding a 1976 ruling. They did keep the door open to intervene in cases of racial gerrymandering, because that gets into the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its amendments. So they didn't close the door on that one. Well, my colleagues, one mathematician and one geographer, drew a number of different hypothetical maps. And essentially their conclusions were that it's true. You just can't pin down an objective definition of gerrymandering. And looking for messy districts like the earmuff district in Chicago shaped like a pair of earmuffs, or the one in North Carolina, also from the 90s, where if you changed lanes on the freeway, you were changing back and forth between two different congressional districts. It was so narrow in certain places. Messy looking districts do not necessarily mean poor representation. For one thing, you have to deal with urban centers, you have to deal with islands, coasts, funny shaped boundaries, and so forth. But also that sometimes messy shaped districts might be more representational than neatly drawn ones. The Missouri 5th District right now, for example, is part of Jackson County and then several rural counties to the east, which elects a Democrat, Emanuel Cleaver. And with Democrats being more than 41% of the population in Missouri, that district, which appears gerrymandered, may actually be better representation than a neater drawn district that maybe would elect Republicans and would combine Kansas City with rural areas. So I'd really caution you against looking at a messy map and saying, oh, that district's gerrymandered. You have to do a real statistical analysis to see if a district is representative of the people of the state or not. You can't just look at the shape on the map. And ultimately, my colleagues agreed with the Rucho ruling that you just can't mathematically or in words pin down an objective definition of what exactly gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering is kind of like government waste. If government spends money on somebody else, it's government waste. If government spends money on me, it's an investment. If gerrymandering hurts my political party, then it is gerrymandering. If redistricting helps my political party, then it's creative districting, or districting to better represent minorities or something like that. It's just really hard to pin down. And finally, one last point, and I'll end on this. Those who affiliate with the Democratic Party, and I know that the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, but those who affiliate with the Democratic Party need to be really careful on gerrymandering because Democrats have a huge problem right now with their voters being concentrated in big cities and their suburbs. In the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes, but they all came from California. And, you know, in Missouri, it's 41% Democratic, but there are only 3 Democratic voting counties and 1 independent city in the entire state: Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia. So Democrats' problems don't just come from Republican gerrymandering. They come from so many Democratic voters being packed into urban areas that Democrats are right that right now Republicans have more opportunities to gerrymander than Democrats do. If you look at which states let the state legislature draw districts and which states have nonpartisan commissions, Democratic voting big states are more likely to have nonpartisan commissions, like in California. Hi, Patricia. I see your chat, and yes, I'd be happy to talk about the 3rd district in Kansas. Democrats are right that they have more to lose from gerrymandering. That's correct. But Democrats need to understand also that when you have so many of your voters packed into urban areas, you would almost have to gerrymander the other way for Democrats to have fair representation, kind of like the 5th district in Missouri, which is this weird district that's the western half of Jackson County and then some rural counties. I got a request on chat to mention also the 3rd district of Kansas. I've just been studying that, so sure, why not? So the 3rd district in Kansas is the Kansas City Area 1. It's currently Johnson and Wyandotte counties and the city of Lewisburg in Miami County. We have the Census 2020 data now, and you cannot draw a district, forget Lewisburg. Just Johnson and Wyandotte County have too many people for a district. One or both of those counties is going to have to be split, or it will not hit the population targets. I drew my own hypothetical map, in which I kept cities whole. I couldn't keep Johnson County whole. And if I tried to split Wyandotte County, I had to split it in half. And I didn't want to do that. So, but I was able to keep cities whole. So I moved Gardner, Spring Hill, Edgerton, DeSoto, and unincorporated rural Johnson County into the 2nd district. And the rest of Johnson County, including all of Overland Park, all of Olathe, Shawnee, Lenexa, Northeast Johnson County, and all of Wyandotte County, I could keep together in the 3rd. But there is a push to gerrymander the 3rd district in an attempt to defeat Congresswoman Davids. And if that happens, it's going to be a really weird map. And what may happen is that they may put Wyandotte County in what's called the Big First District, which is rural, central, and western Kansas. The reason being, if they moved Wyandotte County to the 2nd district, it would be in a district with Lawrence and Topeka, and that would make the 2nd a Democratic district. So they have to take the Republican Big First District and wrap it up around and come down and pick up Wyandotte County to do that. And that would be a district that went from Missouri to Colorado. So that's just something to keep an eye on. There's also talk of breaking up the 5th district in Missouri and breaking it in half and putting it in 2 rural districts to defeat Congressman Cleaver. But in both cases, a lot of Republicans in both states are saying, we don't have any plans to do that. But we haven't seen any maps yet, except for hypotheticals, so we'll see. Right. So there you have it. I'm sure there are plenty of things I haven't mentioned, but let's do Q&A now.
Great, thank you so much. If you've got, I'm going to take you off spotlight. And so if you've got a question, please, actually, I'm going to ask my husband to take you off spotlight because he's my tech person. But if you've got a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. And I see, Stacy, you've got one. I'm going to ask one first, if you don't mind, Stacy, which is, I have about 12 questions written down. I'm going to just pick the first one. What state is the best? What state has the best voting access? And can you describe that for us, what that looks like?
Well, that's an excellent question. Minnesota typically has the highest voter turnout, and Minnesotans are very boastful about that. They like to, just like Texans like to remind people about what they're proud of. Minnesotans also have their own kind of pride, and they love their voter turnout. Some of that is same day voter registration. There's no closing date. Register to vote. Hi, Elizabeth. I see your question, so thank you. But let's stick with Ann's question for now, and then we'll move on to Elizabeth's. So on Minnesota, the same day voter registration, I think, makes a huge difference. Another thing in Minnesota is just the quality of election administration. We are moving, in my opinion, and I think this is consistent with the beliefs of League of Women Voters. It shouldn't be a partisan thing at all, and you're not a partisan organization. We're moving in the wrong direction on election laws right now in this country toward more partisan election officials, whereas most other countries and states that do it well, like Minnesota, they use more nonpartisan. It's viewed as a job for a professional who is an expert in election laws rather than partisan appointees. And so I think that's a big factor. But then the last piece is the political culture. It's just a very participatory political culture up there. Now, in terms of the most progress, though, I gotta shout out Utah. I mean, their voter turnout rate was horrific. Another state that has weirdly low voter turnout is Hawaii. Their voter turnout is horrible. And I think that's so funny that in November, people in Minnesota and Maine will go and vote. They have the highest voter turnout, but people in Hawaii won't. Right. So it's okay to go out in November in Minnesota, but not in Hawaii. Maybe they're too busy surfing. I don't know. But Utah is another one. I mean, their voter turnout was just awful. And they essentially copied Colorado. It was not partisan because Utah is one of the most Republican states in America. Colorado is a former purple state that now leans blue, but Democratic because of migration. They didn't care. They just wanted good laws. Their voter turnout rate is now right in the middle, which is amazing considering where they were starting. And there are problems with mail-in voting. It's not the conspiracy theory junk. It's not that. The problem with mail-in voting is these signature pads and verifying signatures. And so we're going to have to fix that. But overall, Utah has done a fine job. So they're another one that I think deserves a big shout out. And then the last one I'll mention, Ann, is Washington State. They were the first to do full statewide mail-in voting, and they had problems. For example, they mailed out ballots to people that had been convicted of felonies and had not completed their parole or probation. And that you're not supposed to do that. But you got to give credit to Washington because they became an early adapter and they were able to troubleshoot the problems so that when other states like Colorado and Utah joined them, they were able to learn from Washington. So I think it takes a certain amount of courage to be an early adapter and know that you're going to make mistakes and catch your mistakes.
I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna go out of order because Donna asked a good follow-up question to that, and then I'm gonna let Stacy ask hers, and then Elizabeth. So Donna asked, where does Missouri rate on ease of voting? So where are we? And
Missouri is a
I know you're
weird
in
one.
Kansas, so maybe you know
I'm
the
not.
Kansas ranking
I'm
better.
not. I'm a Missourian.
Oh,
I have a place in Emporia, but my home is Kansas City, and also I'm a Mizzou grad, so I bleed black and gold. But Emporia State's a good place to work, and as you know, and I've worked with some cool people, so kind of a bi-state guy. But anyway, Missouri's really weird. Missouri is an outlier because Missouri is the only state in America that doesn't have early voting. Now, you might think that Missouri has early voting because Missouri, certain jurisdictions in Missouri, like Kansas City, the portion of Kansas City in Jackson County has its own election board, and that's a legacy of Pendergast, trying to clean up the Pendergast machine. But anyway, places like Kansas City and Jackson County have tried to make absentee voting as easy as possible. They've set up a system where you go in, off why you can't vote on election day. The notary's right there. And recently they did away with the notary requirements for Missouri. So it almost feels like you're early voting, but technically you're not. There is no early voting in Missouri. There's absentee voting, but that's with an excuse. They wanted to get an election bill in the Missouri General Assembly this term that would, on the one hand, that would provide no excuses absentee voting, which is still not quite early voting, but it's a step, but also impose photo ID requirements. But they just didn't get that through. And so that didn't happen. And so in terms of voter, Missouri's not too bad, actually about average. Most jurisdictions in Missouri don't have long voting lines. The one exception is the city of St. Louis. St. Louis, even today, their election administration is a bit of a mess. Now, the St. Louis County is quite a bit better. But the city of St. Louis do have some long voter lines. However, it doesn't look like that's so much an intentional effort. Voter suppression is just poor administration of elections. And it has gotten better, but they've got some work to do. But Missouri's about average for turnout, but it's a real outlier in not having early voting. It's one of one state that has no early voting.
know that. All right, Stacy, go ahead and unmute and ask the
Okay,
question.
yeah, I understand that states control elections, but it does seem, and I know that there are some federal requirements, et cetera, but I am really disturbed by long lines for some and easy voting for others. And it seems to me that there could be some kind of a federal ruling about the number of voters in that particular precinct, that there should be equal, virtually equal, just like there are requirements to have equal representation in your state governments, et cetera. So can you speak to that?
Oh, I'd be happy to. You make some good points. I'm actually wondering if long lines won't be the new area for lawsuits. Because in and of itself, expecting most people who are not disabled or otherwise limited in mobility or stationed in the military ballots are a whole other issue, things like that. But generally speaking, expecting people to vote in person in and of itself does not depress voter turnout. In fact, it increased voter turnout. There's some evidence that early voting suppresses vote, possibly because it weakens the political campaigns to turn out their voters on election day. The problem, and you know, is the long lines and the fact that not only are there long lines, but that not everyone waits in a long line. They tend to be in diverse urban locations like Atlanta and Tampa and Columbus. And that's discriminatory. So I'm really wondering if the difference in how long people have to wait to vote won't be the subject of new lawsuits. I would really be interested in that. And there have been a few lawsuits on this, and they've kind of gone both directions. So there's not a clear court ruling on this, on the long lines. But the other thing I want to say in response to your question is, I mean, this is the 21st century. You know, you can use your smartphone to order a pizza. You know, and in fact, you could do that 10 years ago, for that matter. You can draw your own congressional districts. Did you know that? You can go to an app called Dave's Redistricting, and all the demographic 2020 census data is in there. You can draw your own congressional districts. So why do you have to vote at the precinct assigned to your home address? Let's say you live in Jackson County, Missouri, and the line is an hour long at the precinct down the road from your house. Why couldn't you drive over to another precinct and vote there? We know that we have the technology to make sure that you get the right ballot and to count that ballot in your jurisdiction. And the reason we know that is because of in-person absentee voting, that when you vote at election headquarters, you could live anywhere in that jurisdiction and they will be sure they print the right ballot and that you cast the right vote in the right jurisdiction. So it would seem to me that if you're stuck in a long line, you should be able to use an app on your phone that will say, the lines are much shorter 5 miles away. Jump on the bus or jump in your car and go vote there and be done with it. And if you don't have mobility, then all those other people going to vote in other locations will shorten the line for you. There's no reason why we don't have the technology to do this. And the idea that you have to vote in the precinct assigned to your home address is archaic. And so that's another thing to look at. There's even a whole branch of mathematics called queuing theory about lines, the study of lines. And forcing people to vote at the polling precinct location closest to their house is not necessary. And I think it would be able to, it would really help. Or what if you work 10 miles from home? You could go to the nearest precinct location to where you work that's in your jurisdiction. Let's say you live in Jackson County and work in Johnson County. You could go to a place right on state line. You couldn't vote in Johnson County because that's another state, but you could go to the closest possible location in your jurisdiction, vote there, and then pop back over to work during your lunch hour. I mean, there are so many possibilities here.
Is there anybody working on those are those possibilities working their way through the systems or no?
Yes. In fact, I was just visiting with a friend from California who told me they already do that. You have to be in your jurisdiction, right? So if you live in Los Angeles County, you have to vote in Los Angeles County, but you don't have to vote at the one closest to your house. So yes, it's being done in certain states, but in other states, they're actually cracking down on people voting outside their precinct location, which that's just going to make the lines longer.
Okay, Elizabeth asked, could you talk about ballot harvesting versus truly helpful neighbors, family members, et cetera, helping to deliver ballots?
Sure, why not? Ballot harvesting is a politicized term. It was coined by political activists. It probably comes from the controversy about almost 10 years ago regarding an organization called Acorn, which did have a chapter in Kansas City. And that was just mass confusion and misrepresentation all over the place. So what happened was this: in Las Vegas and Kansas City, interestingly, Acorn paid its canvassers by the number of voter registration applications, which we now know was a mistake, because some of these canvassers, seeking to boost their pay, falsified voter registration applications. And in many cases, they falsified them in comical ways, like putting Mickey Mouse or Wile E. Coyote on there, or, celebrities who don't even live in Nevada or Missouri. So it was pretty obvious. The Acorn supervisor or the county election board caught these mistakes. Not one fraudulent voter was ever entered into the system as a result of this. It was sloppiness on the part of Acorn. Not one fraudulent registration even was ever cast, let alone fraudulent vote as a result of these errors. However, a political activist named James O'Keefe made a selectively edited video, which went viral and sparked outrage about this group, Acorn, including the allegations that a process called ballot harvesting was being used. And the process called ballot harvesting was essentially people going to shut-ins, including places like nursing homes, and finding people that were incapacitated, filling out the ballot for them and just having them sign it. There is no concrete evidence of this happening. If anyone does that, it's fraudulent. In most states, to help anyone fill out their ballot in any way requires a court affidavit. There's no evidence of nursing homes facilitating this. There are people that will collect ballots from people who are in facilities like that and deliver them for them. And that includes voter turnout organizations. There's no evidence of anybody filling out the ballot on behalf of these people in that situation, including homeless people is another one. And if they did, they have committed a felony. And so it's a false flag. It's a false flag. But many of these new laws do target collecting and delivering absentee or mail-in ballots on behalf of others and make it very difficult, ostensibly, to stop voter fraud. However, the voter fraud alleged does not exist.
Okay, how about your thoughts on HR 1 and S1 and how that will change voting in the states, the individuals?
Are we talking about the omnibus voting legislation that didn't pass?
I think we are.
thought so.
Yeah.
I thought so. Well, let's talk about it. Well, first of all, we need to remind ourselves that it didn't pass. This was widespread voting reform that was proposed by the Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress shortly after President Biden took office. Had it passed, it would have facilitated more early voting, and it would have overturned, it would have essentially set pretty standardized requirements for voting in federal elections that would override these state requirements like proof of citizenship, which can't be enforced anyway due to court rulings, photo ID and things like that. It would kind of standardize it. It would have ended up in court. The Constitution gives the states the power to set the time, place, and manner of elections, but the federal government could counter on the grounds of civil rights that they needed to do that to protect civil rights of voters. So it would have gone to court, and how it would have been resolved, I don't know. But again, 40 years ago, progressive voting reforms weren't partisan. There were tons of Republicans that were very much in favor. The people most opposed to voting law reform back then were Southern Democrats, the old Dixiecrats. Back when we had what was called pre-clearance, before it was overturned in 2013 by Shelby v. Holder, where voting law changes were supposed to be pre-cleared with the Department of Justice because of a history of discrimination. Not all jurisdictions that had pre-clearance were in the South. All of New York City was under pre-clearance. There were counties in South Dakota under pre-clearance, and there were counties in California under pre-clearance. Also a big chunk of the South, but the entire state of North Carolina was not, only certain counties. So, it didn't used to be a partisan thing. It used to be more of a regional thing. The closer you were to Canada, the easier it was to vote. The closer you were to the Gulf of Mexico, the harder it was to vote. And that's all changed. Now it's all red and blue. So you have Democrats trying to expand the right to vote and Republicans trying to restrict it. And ironically, except for felony disenfranchisement, a lot of these laws really don't skew the partisan composition of the electorate anyway.
That's interesting. It's really, you had mentioned statistical analysis of gerrymandered. And by the way, thank you for saying gerrymandered. It's one of my pet peeves. So thank you, thank you. You had mentioned something about statistical analysis, that you can't really tell just by looking at the map. You have to look at an analysis of it. Is there somewhere you can find that analysis?
Yeah, you've got to love math. Mathematicians have gotten pretty deeply into this. One of the most widely used measures is called Polls v. Popper, named after, I believe, a mathematician and a political scientist. It's a pretty complicated mathematical formula. The co-author of our chapter on gerrymandering is a mathematician. Okay, because you have to look at things like how many edges a district has, the ratio of the border of the district. That's a very popular thing to do. What's the ratio of a district's border to its area? The more border relative to area, that's kind of what Polls v. Popper does. The more border relative to area, the more we suspect that there maybe was some gerrymandering going on. Whereas if a district is more compact, less border relative to the area enclosed, then it might be less gerrymandered. But remember, those only measure shapes. And we love visuals, right? That's why I use a lot of maps in my teaching. We love visuals. And I get that. I love maps. I could do maps all day. But the reality is they're not always the best indicator. There are other formulas that don't even look at the shape of a district at all. They look at representation. Let me give you an example. Most representational schemes, and that is what political science call them, is schemes, which is kind of funny. I think we get that from, I think that's the British influence. What they tend to do is slightly overrepresent majorities and slightly underrepresent minorities, or they heavily overrepresent majorities and heavily underrepresent minorities. But it's not possible to have a perfect representation. It isn't possible mathematically. Somebody's going to get the short end of the stick. But the goal is to have fair representation, but you're going to probably exaggerate the representation of the majority a little bit, right? So what you can do, like, let's take Missouri, for example. Missouri, about 41% of Missourians voted for Biden in 2020. If you do some quick math and round up for the majority, Republicans should have 5 of Missouri's 8 congressional districts. Democrats should have 3. In fact, Republicans have 6 of 8. And Democrats have 2, and there's talk of gerrymandering the 5th district, so Republicans would have 7, although I don't know that that's going to happen. I don't think it is. I think they'll make the 2nd district near St. Louis more Republican, not the 5th. But anyway, so I really prefer to look at representation instead of math. I love maps, but I think, forget the shape. You really need to look at representation. And it's not just party. What about racial minorities? The Voting Rights Act of 1990 mandated what are called majority minority districts, districts where a majority of the population is not Caucasian because of historic underrepresentation. Missouri has such a district. It's the first district in St. Louis represented by Cammie Bush. It's technically a plurality minority district, and that will be in play in redistricting. And so sometimes you see these gerrymandered districts that were drawn for better representation of historically marginalized groups. So is that really a bad thing? So I think it's better to look at if different groups in society are fairly represented than the shape of the district on the map.
Well, that's a great segue to our last question, which is, do you think communities of interest, there's some community mapping going on, and Missouri is one of the states that's done the most, I think, community mapping. And so does that help redistricting become or help with their drawing the districts that they are less partisan?
No. No, in fact, I drew a gerrymandered map of Kansas that was egregiously gerrymandered to make the 3rd district Republican, that didn't split a single county. Now, you probably couldn't do that in a bigger state, even a medium-sized state like Missouri, let alone a bigger state like California. But you got to go really careful with these maps. I do support keeping communities of interest together. It's hard enough to get Americans to even know who represents them. Most Americans have no clue. And when you start chopping up, so that the people across the street from me are represented by somebody else, then it just makes that even a bigger mess. And I think you can get better representation if you keep these communities together. Like I said, I did my 3rd district map by just moving whole cities, and I didn't split a single city in Johnson County. I kept them all together. And I just think that's better representation. You have more of a voice with your representative. It's easier for them to know who to contact about local issues. But can you draw an egregiously gerrymandered map that keeps community of interest together? You bet you can. In fact, I've done it. So I know you can. There are other benefits though. I'd hate to see them chop up either of the Kansas cities. I really would. They deserve representation. So, there's that.
Well, I have learned so much today. Thank you so much. If we want to unmute and everybody unmute yourselves and give Dr. Smith a round of applause, please. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to make a whole bunch of announcements. I have a full page of announcements. So buckle your seatbelts. My first announcement is that, I have pre-stamped postcards that we can send out to our representatives. I have about 50 of them, and they are to support For the People Act. So I'm going to put a plastic box on my front porch. You can find my address in the roster, and please come by and grab some and fill them out. You can write, I'll have a little note in there that's a suggested sort of verbiage, but you can write whatever you want, and send those in, please. They have the league symbols, the league logos on them. So come and get some of those. November 13th is the state fall conference. This year, the subject is hot topics, the past, the present, and the future. This will start at 9 a.m. That's when you can go and register, and there's a little social hour until 9:30, and it lasts until 3 o'clock in the afternoon with breaks for lunch and to stretch. It's $25 for in-person, which includes lunch, or you can go virtually, which is on Zoom. I'm going to maybe ask people to re-mute if you don't mind. Carl, maybe you can mute some people. Hear a train or something. Thank you. So Zoom participation, the registration fee is $15, and that covers the materials, the handouts, and such. I don't have information for you yet about how to log on, but we'll send that out in the e-voter when it's available. Because of that, state conference, the November meeting that we normally have is moved to the following Saturday. So that will be the 3rd Saturday in November rather than the 2nd Saturday in November for us. Mary Lindsay will be presenting a program about redistricting tomorrow at All Souls Forum, and that's on Zoom. And Carl is going to put the Zoom link for that in the chat. That's at allsoulskc.org, and then some more. So he'll put that in. Book club is discussing Unfollow on Thursday at 6:30. You can go to lwvkc.org to get the Zoom link for that. So encourage you to join that book club discussion. New member orientation is Wednesday, the 29th at 6 o'clock. New and current members are welcome. I encourage some current members to go to the new member orientation. It's kind of fun to get to meet the new people, and it's really great for new people to get to meet some long timers and some lifers. So encourage you guys
And
to go to that.
the timing is 5 to 6, happy hour. I think you said it starts at 6. It starts at
Okay,
5.
I'm sorry. Okay. Are you okay? You sure?
That's been
Right.
a tradition.
All right, I'll
Yeah,
trust you.
check the calendar, but it should be
We'll-
5 to 6.
We'll double check the calendar on that because this we have contradictory information on that. And then Becky wanted to let everybody know that we need some people on September 17th to go to Harrah's to register voters. This is a new citizen ceremony. It doesn't last very long, but what happens is they have their ceremony, and then they 100 or more new citizens come out, and we want to catch them and get them registered to vote, as many of them as we can. And if we only have 4 or 5 registrars or registration volunteers, then we have long lines, which, as we know, discourages people. We need not long lines. So you do not have to be trained. You don't have to be a registrar to do this. We're using postcards. We'll give you instructions on how to do that. So you do not have to have the special training from the Board of Elections. So please consider coming. The volunteer sign up is on the website. So go and sign up if you would, please. There's a morning shift. And then for those of us who don't get up early in the morning, there's an afternoon shift. Let's see. Yeah, she said we expect 150 new citizens for each event. It's a big deal. It's also in support of the North Kansas City YMCA. They are the ones who are sponsoring the new citizenship. She also mentioned that there are new opportunities on the website that she posts frequently. We're starting to get into registration season. And so we've had a whole bunch of organizations contact us to see if we can help them with voter registration. And also she needs some LWV signage because we have so many voter registration things going on, especially on National Voter Registration Day, that there's a little bit of a dearth of signage at the moment. And last, I want to say another thank you to Dr. Smith for a wonderful program. Very informative. I'm really happy to learn all that. To Pauline, who I keep forgetting to thank for putting these programs together. And so I'm going to give her a special thank you because, yes, thank you, Pauline, because one of the reasons I forget to thank her is because she makes it so easy that I just have my little addenda, everything's taken care of. And so, thank you, Pauline. I really appreciate it. Judy Ann, thank you for setting us up on Facebook Live and taking care of the tech side of it. And then this week to Carl for being my second tech person who I could just text and say, bring me a cord or mute everybody or whatever I needed to do. So thank you, Carl, for helping me. And thank you to all of you for coming. You're welcome to unmute and chat a little before we go for good. And thank you for being members.
Ann, could I say something?
You may.
With the knowing that we do have a position on the death penalty, there's going to be a rally on September 15th at the fountain at Mills Park at noon to just sort of show support for not executing Ernest Johnson, who is a gentleman with a severe developmentally disabled.
Okay. What was that date again?
Yeah, what was the date?
It's October 15th. And is Pat on here? Is that the right date, Pat? Because she and I are both in the Missourians Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So I did.
The date is for the rally is this next Wednesday.
Yeah,
So
the
that's
15th.
September 15th at the Mill Creek Park and the plaza. Yeah, we are hoping for some show on, because Ernest Johnson's execution is a total violation of the Eighth Amendment, and this is a man that's been proven over and over again to be intellectually disabled. So it's something we're working very hard to possibly get a stay. Actually, what's left for him is this clemency, the clemency ruling by Governor Parson. So yeah, that is something that many people are working on, and it's kind of an interesting. I'm talking to people that I never thought I would actually be talking to about the death penalty, the conservatives concerned about the death penalty, which is a group I just discovered across the state, across the nation. There's votes across in many states to repeal the death penalty. So we are heartened